today we're continuing to look at what it means to walk with Jesus. And we're talking about how our walking with Jesus defines who we are. It helps to adjust the priorities of how we live. It is really about how our life is defined, but it also is how our life can be a blessing even to others around us. Our walking with Jesus can actually bless others if we do it right. If we do it with the right spirit, if we do it with the right focus, if we get our priorities in the right order. Jesus tells us in Matthew, the 23rd chapter, beginning in the 11th verse, "The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. When Jesus talks about being a servant, that is where true greatness is found, what we see there is something that rings true with all the teachings of Jesus. There's never a moment when Jesus is teaching his disciples and he tells them to be sure to look out for themselves above all else, to put themselves first. He never tells them that what they need to do is to strive to have the most, to achieve the most, to be the most. No. He talks about take the lowest seat at the table. Don't sit in a place of honor. Then if they want to move you up, they can, but if not, it doesn't really matter. He's always talking about being a servant. And truly, one of the greatest examples of servanthood was when he does, at the Last Supper, knowing that his life will be taken from him within hours, gets up from the table and wraps a towel around himself, pours a basin of water, and does the job the lowest servant would have done in the household. He washes the feet of his disciples. Servanthood seems to be key when we talk about walking with Jesus. And so maybe servanthood and learning to be a servant, learning to serve others, learning to put others first, maybe that's something that we need to focus on a little more often in our lives, because our world seems to push us in other directions. So maybe we need to follow Jesus down the path of servanthood. Back in 1991, Charles Gibbons and a few other people in an organization he led decided that they would go to Papua New Guinea and to the villages in that area on a missionary journey. They were going to, yes, to share the gospel of Jesus with others, but also to try to find ways to lift up their life, to make things better for them in their community, in their setting. And so they traveled there, and they finally ended up in an area where the people in these remote villages had very little contact with the outside world. Now remember, I said 1991. This is not that far into the past. But some of these groups had never seen an outside person before Gibbons and his team arrived. They had no forms of what we would call technology in their village. There was one village he visited where he said he never actually saw a wheel of any sort and wondered if that advancement had arrived yet. It was a different world. They spent a few nights in one village in particular because they were able to communicate with the people who lived there. It was on Mount Gilaway. And when I say that they were able to communicate with people there, that's unique in New Guinea. You see, New Guinea is the most linguistically diverse country in our world. There are 839 different dialects currently spoken in New Guinea. 839. That's a lot. And so when they found a village where they could speak through an interpreter, they stayed there for a few days. Now, what the interpreter was able to speak, Gibbons and his crew didn't understand because it was this mixture of German and English and French and other words and languages that they had never heard of melded together in this dialect. But through the interpreter, Gibbons was able to ask some basic questions to find out about the people and find out about their life. He said, "What do you want for your children? And what are your dreams and your goals for your life?" And he discovered something very unique. In this isolated, very remote part of our world, the people he talked to had the same dreams and fears and desires that the people had in the neighborhood where he lived in America. For each of them, they wanted to have what they would term a good life, a long life. And they wanted their children to have a life that was better than theirs. Isn't that what we hope as well? That we'll have a good life, a long life, but that our children will do even better, will have an even better life than we've ever imagined. You know, they termed it in ways that are a little bit different. They said they wanted a good life in that they wanted security. They wanted to have a good sweet potato crop, and they wanted to own more pigs. I really don't judge much of my life based off of the number of sweet potatoes or pigs that I have. But they did. That was important to them. But they wanted their children to have something better. They wanted their children to have a better status in their village, a better standing in their community than they did, to have more sweet potatoes and more pigs than they had. That was their desire. He said that listening to them, what they wanted, though they had never really encountered many from the outside world, if any at all, what they wanted was no different than anyone else he might meet anywhere else he might meet them. Because that's just part of us, it seems. It's interesting that the personal development of these people in this remote part of New Guinea is the same level of personal development that we have in our world and in our communities. Because that's just the part of life that seems to come natural. Abraham Maslow became famous for what's known as the hierarchy of needs. He said there are 5 levels of needs that we have in our life, and you can think about them like they're on a pyramid. He said the bottom level, the largest level, is the physiological needs that we all have. Things for like food and clothing. We need those. Shelter. He said next up is, that's job security, so that we know that we have safety and protection. And then comes the middle level of the pyramid, and he said that is love and belonging. That's where friendship is and relationships are. And second from the top is esteem and recognition. And then the top level, that's the smallest part of it. And he said that is self-actualization. That's where we become the best person we can be. That's where we are striving to be our best in our world. He said that when our basic needs for such things like food and shelter are met, that's when we get to move on up that level, one at a time, adding another level and another level and another level. But that highest one, self-actualization, personal fulfillment, he said the problem is that highest level, most of us never try to get to. We never strive after. We get stuck at a lower level. We might be, there are many in our world that are stuck at that level looking for food and shelter and clothing. But for most of us, we can get stuck at one of the other levels. We think that when we arrive at one of those levels and we have one of those things, that's as far as we need to go. And it seems like in our world today, so many people get stuck at that level of esteem and recognition. Once people start giving us attaboys and attagirls, and once people start patting us on the back, and once we are known for whatever we're known for, we seem to think that that's it. That we have arrived, that we are done. But we're not done. The scripture tells us we're not done. Because Jesus says if you really want to get there, if you really want to be great, if you really want to achieve the most you can achieve, well, then you have to become a servant. You have to become a servant of others. You have to realize that it's not all about you. Instead, it's all about others. In the scripture, the Pharisees that we encounter quite often is sort of those opponents of Jesus. The Pharisees seem to be stuck at that esteem level that sometimes we're stuck at as well. They're stuck at the esteem level, and Jesus is concerned because at times his disciples get stuck at that level too. They get stuck there as well. Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, we read the story where Jesus has been in Caesarea Philippi, and while he's there, he talks to his disciples. He tells them that he's going to be handed over into the hands of evil people, then that he will be crucified, and he will die, and that he will rise from the dead. When they leave Caesarea Philippi and they start walking back toward the Galilee, it's not that long of a journey. But as they're walking, with that information still has to be sort of swirling in their minds and in their hearts, Jesus overhears the disciples walking along the road, arguing with each other as which one of them is the greatest. Who's better than who? I've always wondered what criteria they used when the disciples debated this, because they debated this several times. You know, is it, well, I'm taller than you, so that makes me greater. Or I'm a little older than you, so that makes me better. Or I'm smarter, or I run faster, or I look better. What was their criteria for greatness? Doesn't seem to be servanthood. They seem to miss that. When Jesus talks about the Pharisees, he talks about these religious leaders who consider themselves the experts of their time in all things faith. But he always seems to lift them up as not our example, but as an example of the kind of people we don't want to be. Because they're arrogant and they're judgmental, and their attitude oftentimes alienates people from them and even alienates them from God's kingdom. And so after he points out sort of how they act and how they behave and what they think are important, he looks at his followers and he says, but you don't have to be that way. You don't have to be that way. You see, there's a step above that esteem and that recognition. There's servanthood. There was an interesting survey done where, and it's one of the simplest surveys ever, survey done in trying to see how people viewed themselves in this world. And they asked one question: tell me about yourself. And almost to a person, when asked, tell me about yourself, they immediately started telling what they did for a living. Well, tell me about yourself. I'm a doctor. Tell me about yourself. Well, I'm a lawyer, or I'm a nurse, I'm a pharmacist, I'm a teacher. That's how they define themselves. They went even to those who are retired. Tell me about yourself. Well, I retired as a doctor. I retired as a nurse. I mean, they immediately start identifying themselves that way. And so often that's what we do. Tell me about yourself. I'm going to explain to you how I matter and what level I achieved so that you'll understand the role I play and my importance and my intelligence and my, and my pedigree in whatever this is. We're so often to do that, like the Pharisees did in so many ways. But isn't it impressive? Isn't it overwhelming? Isn't it humbling when you encounter somebody that's not like that? I remember when I first arrived here 12 years ago. I was preaching all 3 services one Sunday morning, and at 9:45 service, I was preaching in that service, and toward the back row of the front section over here, I was walking around and saying hello to some people because I was just getting to know people. And I walked up to a gentleman and introduced myself, and he replied back and just simply said, "Hi, I'm Scotty." And I said, "Well, Scotty, tell me about yourself." And Scotty just said, he basically said, "Don't worry about me. Let me tell you about this great church, and let me tell you about this wonderful community. You're just going to be blessed. It's a wonderful place. You're never going to want to live anywhere else other than here." I mean, he kept going on, and I laughed and said, "You should work for the city." And at that point, not realizing I was talking to former Mayor Scotty McCallum, former president of UAB, Scotty McCallum, but he was not in that moment President Scotty McCallum or Mayor Scotty McCallum. He was just Scotty. And Scotty wanted to tell me about his great church, and Scotty wanted to tell me about his great city, because these were the things, and he was telling me about all the ways that I could be involved in the city, and because that was where his heart was. He was a servant leader in so many ways. And those of you that knew him really well, you knew he was a servant leader. We don't have to identify ourselves by stating, what education we have, and be identified by our job or things like that. I think our greatest identifier is the fact that we get our identity from God. First and foremost, we are children of God, and as a child of God, we're free to be that person that God is calling us to be, to do the things that God is calling us to do, to make the difference that God is enabling us to make in this world. And that's what's important. To put God first and to find ways to serve God. That's what's important. Not too many days before Jesus is sitting with his disciples and telling them this story, he's with them, and they ask him the question, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he takes a child and stands a child in their midst. And he tells them that child is their model. That unless they become like children, that the doors of the kingdom just won't open, that they have to become like children. I mean, in the first century, no one respected children or valued children. In the first century, children were looked down on because they were vulnerable, and they were seen as weak and dirty. They had no right. They were given no respect. They were given no recognition or consideration. So to call them great in any sense of the word was ridiculous. But Jesus says, this is great. Following Jesus is following Jesus in a world where things are different. What we think important may not be. What we may not value as much may be critical. Jesus took the opportunity to remind his disciples, he says, whoever is greatest among you is your servant. You must be willing to serve. In God's kingdom, the measure of greatness is not the notions of success and achievement, but it's service and considering others before yourself. It's striving toward that top portion of the pyramid and in the hierarchy of needs. It's moving toward that self-actualization. It's moving toward figuring out what God is calling you to do and then doing it. What would it take for you to say that was your goal? What changes would you need to make? Would you say that each day or each week or maybe in the last month, would you say that you have done something to make a difference for others? that you have put others before yourself. That you have been a servant in some way, some form, some fashion. I mean, after all, we probably all have our basic needs met, that bottom tier of the hierarchy of needs. We don't really worry where we're going to sleep tonight and things like that. And our only concern about our food is probably the great question we're all wrestling with right now is where we're going to eat for lunch. Not if we're going to eat lunch, but where are we going to eat lunch? But far too many of us get stuck in the middle of that pyramid. I mean, we get focused on our job. We get focused on issues around relationship. We get focused on status. And we get stuck in those places and we allow them to consume our time and our attention so much so that we don't realize that there's more. That there's more we should be striving for. The highest level, the greatest level, the servant level. Now, Jesus criticized the Pharisees at times because they get stuck in that mid-range. I mean, for the most part, while yes, they're always the ones that are sort of the antagonist of Jesus. They question Jesus at times, and we see them. That's how we encounter them. For the most part, the Pharisees weren't villains. They weren't evil. They were people like us. They were trying to do their best. They were trying to serve God in some way. But they were also playing games that you and I often play. And that is, they were playing the game of success. But that was what was more important, being known and seen as a success. And they had their own way of showing off that they had arrived at this level that they felt like only very few people could reach. Jesus said, some of them, they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garment, and they love the higher places at the feast and the chief seats in the synagogues and to be greeted with favor in the marketplace. I know you're sitting there going, wow, phylacteries. That's great. The phylacteries were these little small leather boxes that the scripture in the Old Testament says they were supposed to wear on their forehead and on their arm. And inside of that little box, you would have scriptures from Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus, it was about how God brought them out of the land of Egypt. And Deuteronomy, it was the portion that talks about how they should love God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. It was just supposed to be a little box, a little small leather box. But they had started making theirs larger so that everyone could see them from wherever they might be. And then the fringes of their robe. According to the scripture in the book of Numbers, they're supposed to have the fringe of their robe as a constant reminder of God's commandments. You're supposed to have these tassels that are on the fringe of your robe, and every time you see them as you're walking or sitting and you see the fringes of your robe, you're supposed to ask yourself, am I following God's law? Am I obeying all the commands? But now, it wasn't about them and their faith. Now they're making the fringes of their robe longer than anyone else so that everyone could see their robes. Everyone could see that. They're trying to look better than others. They're trying to look more spiritual than others. They're trying to look more powerful than others. They're trying to look like something they're not. The Pharisees were playing a game that we often get caught up in and we often play. We want other people to recognize us and respect us and if we're lucky, even envy us if we do it right. That's not the goal. My mother used to tell a story from when she was young and they bought their first car. My grandfather he didn't really know about buying a car. He finally decided he would buy a car, but he wasn't going to invest a lot of money in it because he didn't know if he would ever use it much. Yeah, that seems odd to me. So he didn't invest in what he termed frills in the car. And so my grandparents did not buy a car with air conditioning. Now, my mother had friends whose parents did have cars with air conditioning. So whenever my mother and my aunt, who was older, who drove, whenever they would go somewhere and they would see those friends, they would quickly roll their windows up so that when they rode by, they might be sweating up a storm inside there like an oven, but they would think that their friends would look at them and go, "Ooh, look, they have air conditioning." We just like that, don't we? I mean, we just want people to recognize us and respect us and play it just right. Maybe they'll envy us a little bit. But that's not what it's about. I mean, I know that we all want to do our best. I mean, how many of us get up every day and say, "Today, my goal is to be number 2"? I mean, that's just not in us. And there's nothing wrong with ambition. There's nothing wrong with the desire to do well, to do our best. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to realize that there's still more to life. Jesus said that if we want to achieve greatness, greatness that will last, greatness that will truly make a difference, that greatness comes from being a servant. Last week, during the State of the Church address, we gave out the State of the Church booklets, and there's plenty of them around the building if you didn't get one. But on the last page, the back cover of that, we had a list of ways to serve. And we're starting to get those turned in now. It's ways to serve in and through our church. Because, see, we do take this seriously. This idea that the esteem and recognition is not the top of the pyramid, but instead encouraging and calling all of us to that place of servant leadership, that place of service, that's the top of the pyramid. So finding our places to serve is critical. Finding our place where we put something on our calendar because that's what we're going to do for God, and we don't let anything take that off our calendar or get in the way of that. And so we're trying to find ways for each of us to give our time and our resources, our energy to God through serving. And so I hope that you'll think about that and begin to pray about what God may be calling you to do to help you move up into that highest level, to move up into servanthood and servant leadership. Unfortunately, most of us really don't live there 24/7. I know very few people that I truly count that live in that top part of that pyramid where the highest hierarchy of need is sort of where they are all day, every day. Very few people are ever there. But think about the people you know that are there quite often and the difference they make in our world and in our lives. To think about how God calls all of us to be striving toward that, going toward that all day, every day. So what can you do? How can you serve? We try, as a church, we try to give you as many opportunities as we can through being in choir and bell choir and praise band, being able to help lead us in worship through music, going to Hope Lodge or First Light and helping to serve a meal and give encouragement, being a greeter, an usher, welcoming people in and helping them feel wanted into the church. You could volunteer to be a part of our English as second language class. One of our teachers there. And trust me, if you don't have to know a second language to teach in the English as second language class. If you can understand me, then you can teach. You can be a part of that program, part of that ministry, because you're speaking the language the people are wanting to learn. And they need people to talk to and to interact with. And so you could be a blessing there. You could help in the elementary area on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or in the preschool area. Be in the youth ministry as a small group leader or help with the prayer breakfast. And we can all give to the Next Gen campaign and continue to watch that ministry flourish and draw more young people into the church. As Sherry said, this past week, mean, we placed 4 cars through our car ministry. 35 cars so far this year repaired or placed. I mean, think about on the hierarchy of needs, we're helping people achieve those basic levels of reliable transportation to get food, to get work. I mean, that's powerful. There's so many ways to be involved in that through donating cars or donating money to buy cars or gas cards for the people who receive cars, or we have a team of folks who help to place cars. And if you ever want to have your life touched, be a part of one of those placements. This past week, after one of the 4 left, I talked to one of our people that were a part of that, and they said they'd never seen anyone hug a steering wheel and cry before. But when she received the car, this woman hugged the steering wheel and wept for 5 minutes because y'all changed her life through that car. I mean, every 2 weeks, our food pantry feeds about 250 or more families. I mean, that's a lot of people. You could be part of the team that distributes that 1 week or every 2 weeks, whatever works in your schedule. Or you could help donate money to buy the turkeys and the ham and all the foods that goes with them for Thanksgiving and Christmas. That's coming up soon. Or probably most of us could participate in that ministry when we're at the grocery store. Buy 1 more bag of staple goods and just drop them by one of the bins in the church. Goes out to feed one of those families. There are prayer teams that you can be a part of. Lifting up others in prayer. Putting others first when you go before God in prayer. Joining the Hannah prayer team where they pray for the expectant moms and the new little babies. Praying for them is such a special thing. And this is just a tip of the iceberg or maybe the tip of the pyramid of all the things that you could do. But what are you doing? What are your ways of serving, of putting others first? Remember, you are number 1 when you can embrace the needs of others around you and help them know that they matter, that they are valued. You are the greatest when you can see the pain and the trouble in another person's face and take the time to ask what's going on and listen while they pour out their heart. You're a success when you can stick up for somebody who has been being treated unjustly. You are really somebody when you can take your time and go and sit by a hospital bed and hold the hand of someone who's facing things that you're not at that moment, but you're there to help them. You are first when you don't mind being last for the sake of another person. When you put someone else ahead of yourself. Someone's needs ahead of your own. Would you say that each day or each week or each month you do something to make a difference for somebody else? That each day, week, or month, you put someone else's needs ahead of yourself, that you make sure that you put them first and you find a way to serve, or you give your time, your attention, your energy, your resources for others. Do you do that each day? Do you work it in each week? Do you squeeze it in each month? Jesus says the greatest will be my servant. My hope is that we will all begin to make this a priority in our life, and that we will all begin to strive for what Jesus would say is true and lasting greatness. may we become a servant to those around us. In his name we offer this.